Chapter 7 concentrates on property and related crimes. The first crime that we'll consider is larceny theft. When we think of property crimes, we typically think of thefts. So under the common law, a theft was either known as a theft or as larceny. So we still see those terms used today. What were the basic elements of the common law larceny theft? And when we say common law, we mean traditional theft definitions from as much as hundreds of years ago. Well, the traditional common law definition of larceny theft included a trespass retaking. What we mean by trespass retaking is the person who is taking the thing of value, the good, the item, the property, did not have permission to take it. Trespass retaking was accompanied by a carrying away, which we know from the last chapter, chapter 6, relating to kidnapping, is associated with the term asportation. So the property had to actually be removed from the location where it was originally and taken to some other location. Without that, there was no carrying away and thus no larceny theft. The item that was taken had to be personal property. So by personal property, we typically mean things that are movable, that we can touch and that are movable. So even though we can touch land, we can touch a house, those things are not considered personal property. Those are considered real property. And so larceny theft only applied to personal property that was taken. And so therefore it had to be things like clothing, jewelry, any kind of item that was personal, that could be moved, that could be touched. So it wasn't intellectual property. They didn't have a notion of intellectual property a few hundred years ago. But these were items that today we would consider our belongings. It had to be property of another person. So obviously you can't steal your own property. And there had to be an intent to steal, which we'll see in one of our next presentations, that what we mean by intent to steal is an intent to deprive. So to deprive the owner of the use of that property permanently or for such a period that it really meant that the owner did not have access to it. So even if you said, well, I didn't mean to take it away permanently, you were taking it for long enough that it was depriving the owner of the use and enjoyment of that property. As society becomes more creative, and maybe it had always been that creative, as thieves became more creative, I should say, and again, maybe they were always that creative, they found different ways to steal things. So some of those elements we just looked at could be avoided, and so the question was it still a theft? So as we go through this list of types of common law larceny theft, we'll see that they really evolve from the original common law definition that we just went through in the last slide to different permutations of it, different types of it, different alterations of the original. So maybe there was one element that was either not present from the original common law theft, or maybe the thief was abusing it to such a degree to deprive the owner without satisfying all the elements of traditional common law theft. So over time, other types of theft evolve. And this will make more sense as we go through the examples. So the most common, basically what we just went over, was theft by stealth. And so this was sneaking the property away from someone, taking it without them realizing it. And so again, that would be the trespass retaking of personal property by another, and moving it and depriving the owner, etc., etc., etc. All the elements of the common law larceny theft crime. But what happens if the person was working for the owner and took the property? Well, technically speaking, if this was a servant who was using their employer's property, then it was not a trespass retaking. So the item was in their possession because the employer allowed them to have it. So this is Bob Cratchit working for Ebenezer Scrooge, and Bob Cratchit takes some of the money home with him from Scrooge's business, and he has access to the money. He has access to maybe other items in Scrooge's business, and so Scrooge allows him to have access to that. But did Scrooge really allow him to take the items for his own personal use? Well, if we're talking about the Scrooge before the ghost visit, then we'd say definitely no, he would not have allowed him. So if Bob Cratchit, maybe instead of taking money, had taken some coal home so that he could warm his house, even though Scrooge had allowed him to have a meager amount of coal while he was at work, Scrooge did not want him to take that home with him. So, but again, this wouldn't have satisfied the traditional common law larceny theft by stealth, because Scrooge had allowed Bob Cratchit to have access to the coal. So we had to develop theft by servant as another type of theft. So what we were saying was, yes, this person had access to the item, so it wasn't a trespass retaking, but it wasn't for the intended, they didn't use it for their employer, they used it for themselves. And so today we'd see this more as we might see this as the modern crime of embezzlement, where you're taking money from your employer. You're taking some other item from your employer. Another kind of theft was if you found lost, mislaid, or misdelivered property that you took it for your own use, even though you knew it was lost, you knew it was mislaid, you knew it was misdelivered, and you could have easily returned it to the rightful owner. So we're going to see when we cover this type of crime and how the Model Penal Code treats it, we're going to see that the Model Penal Code requires that you make at least a reasonable effort. First of all, you have to know that it's lost, mislaid, or misdelivered. And then secondly, you have to make at least a reasonable effort if any kind of effort is possible. I mean, if this is something that's just lying on a busy street, it's a $20 bill that just happens to be lying in the middle of the street and there's no way to find out who the owner was, we're not going to expect you to take the $20 bill to the local CSI and have them dust for fingerprints and do a $10,000 investigation to return a $20 bill. We're not going to require that. So in some instances you may not have to do anything because nothing would be reasonable. But if this was, for instance, misdelivered property, you know this is a package that was delivered through the mail to your house, but it really belonged to your neighbor, and all you have to do is walk over to your neighbor to give it to them, but you don't do it, then if it's later found out that you kept the property that was misdelivered, you could be charged with theft of lost, mislaid, or misdelivered property. Theft by Bailey means that if you turn over your goods to someone like UPS or FedEx or someone, you want them to deliver it to another person or another location, once again, if they keep it for themselves, then this isn't a trespass retaking because you gave the items to them. But obviously you didn't give the items to the FedEx delivery person so that that person could keep the item for themselves. You wanted them to follow through and deliver it to someone else. So we created the law of theft by bailee. And so, again, the bailee is that person who takes your goods, but not for their personal use, but to be delivered somewhere, to be transported somewhere. But if they steal it, if they keep it for themselves, if they deprive you of possession of it, or the person who you're delivering the item to, then they can be charged with a theft. But again, under common law, larceny theft, one of the elements would have been missing was the trespass retaking. So we had to develop a whole new class of crimes, theft by bailee. Theft by trick would again deal with whether you had voluntarily given over the goods or not, because if you're tricked into giving them over, it appears on first impression that you had willfully turned over the goods to this person. But what if that person had deceived you? You thought that they were someone else. Maybe this is someone who is dressing up as a police officer and saying, we have to take your particular piece of property because it's evidence, or whatever it may be. We need your car because we have to chase down a suspect and we're on foot, so we need to requisition it for our own use. And you turn over your car to them, and it turns out that they're a thief, and they take off with your car and never return with it. Well, under the traditional common law larceny, you had basically turned it all over to them. You had willingly given it to them, but obviously you'd only done it because you were deceived. You thought this was a police officer. So we need laws that deal with a theft by trick. And we created those categories. Today we would view that as the modern crime of fraud, or theft by deception, as it's sometimes called in many states. So either theft by deception or theft by fraud, either of those are essentially theft by trick.